I suffer from social anxiety just a bit more than you might expect, even for a typically introverted engineering student. So last summer after my freshman year, I avoided opportunities for internships in people-dense environments, like the giant aerospace employers. And instead I did an internship with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources at a state park. It was a non-academic internship, since my major is computational engineering, not forestry. But it paid $13 an hour, and gave me something to do for the summer, plus the idea of being outdoors sounded good to me. Hopefully next year I can intern at a small company. Maybe the kind of research firm where you get to work a lot independently. Most of the work was what you'd expect. Trail maintenance, emptying trash cans, cleaning up after campers, and so on. But for 1 week towards the end of the summer, I got assigned to a small team to help collect data as part of some forest management project. Each day I would get a list of GPS coordinates to hike to and take some measurements using a kit of instruments the DNS people provided. Soil samplers, a logger's tape to determine tree diameter breast height, and so on. Easy stuff. The interns who were forestry majors were given a few additional tools, like densitometers, to estimate tree spacing and look for canopy thinning. I was also given a small handheld electronic device with an LCD display, and some lights and switches on it. It didn't look too different from a sound meter or an ohm-meter, but there was no unit markings or labels, so I couldn't really tell what it was supposed to measure. I was just told to turn it on at each GPS location on my list, wait for the green light to come on, and write down the digital readouts. One of the other interns thought it was an air sampling tool, maybe for checking pollution or pollen levels. We were dropped off in pairs along a service road that cut through the forest. I was teamed with a girl named Janine, a forestry major who I had worked with once or twice before. The GPS coordinates on our list formed a clockwise loop about 6 miles long, with our drop-off/pickup location being the northernmost point on the loop. We had backpacks with bottled water and our lunches in them, as trekking 6 miles through fairly dense forest was going to take much of the day. We also had a long-range walkie-talkie for emergencies. Our fifth coordinate took us south into what was marked on our map as a protected wilderness area, off limits to the public to minimize human disturbance. The trees here were older and larger, and maybe a bit further spaced apart than the area we had just left. The terrain was rougher, with lots of small hillocks and gullies, and lots of undergrowth and deadfall. Janine told me that before settlers came to Ohio, a squirrel could cross the state from one side to the other without touching the ground, but the settlers had cut down most of everything since. There were only a dozen or so original old-growth forests area remaining in Ohio, like the one we were in now, untouched by human hand, except for maybe the Shawnee and their prehistoric ancestors. I was deep in thought on our way to the sixth coordinate, close to the southernmost part of the loop, contemplating just how unchanged this area must have been, for who knows how many thousands of years. Maybe even since the end of the last ice age, as we worked our way through a particularly dense section of underbush, beneath massive oak trees, it seemed to me that an ancient and timeless feeling hung heavy in the air. I could imagine how first Native Americans crossing through this forest many thousands of years ago, finding it much like it was now. As the underbrush gave way to a small clearing, there stood an intercom box mounted on a post. For a moment, Janine and I just stared at it, neither one of us moving or speaking. It was certainly jarring to come across such a man-made device in this particular context, immediately violating the primeval feeling of the forest. Then I began mentally seeking to rationalize the box's existence here. Perhaps, after all, it was just part of some communication system or emergency call box for fire lookout parties. The call box and post looked old, with red paint flaking off and rust showing through. The box itself was rectangular with a speaker grill and a single round button that had probably been beige or white at one point, but had yellowed badly. On the back of the box was a logo of some kind, faded almost to the point of illegibility. But I could discern a large J2 in a retro-futuristic looking way that might have come from the 1950s, superimposed over some kind of spiral pattern. The bottom edges of the box were badly corroded, all the way through in places. The post was square in cross-section and anchored into the cracked and discolored concrete pad about 2 feet across. With a glance at Janine, I pushed the button. Nothing happened, not even a crackle of static or anything. Janine pushed it a couple times too, and said, "Hello? Hello?" But there was no response. We shared our speculations about what the box might be as we continued on our route. But something interesting did happen at our sixth coordinate. which was another couple hundred yards or so past the intercom. When I turned on the electronic measuring device, it made clicking sounds much like a Geiger counter, and the numbers on the dial readout were more than twice as high as any of our previous measurements had been. I aimed it at different directions, but the numbers stayed the same. Apparently the device was not directional. So I walked 100 feet further west and tried again. Then came back to the coordinate and walked 100 feet south. Janine caught on to what I was doing and started writing down the numbers as I tried different locations. Pretty soon we had established that the numbers were increasing most rapidly as we moved in a south-southwestern direction. I looked at Janine questioningly, and she nodded in agreement. We continued in that direction, pausing every couple hundred feet to check the readings, and see if we were still heading towards increasing numbers. As the numbers climbed, the clicks blended together into a low buzz, which rose in pitch until it was kind of more of a squeal you'd get from a metal detector passing over buried coins. The forest was completely silent, and light started to get weird in some subtle way. We found ourselves occasionally losing our balance and stumbling. One minute we would ascend a rise that seemed to pull us along as if we were going downhill. The next minute we would suddenly have to lean sideways or forward to keep on our feet. I pulled the logger's tape from the DNS kit and dangled it like a plumb bomb to confirm that the local gravity vector kept randomly changing, by as much as 15 degrees or so depending on where you stood. After we had gone roughly half a mile from the 6th coordinate, the electronic box didn't make any more squealing sound, but the light came on red instead of green, and the numbers on the readout were flashing. But now there was also an electric feeling in the air. Janine had visible goosebumps, and my hair felt like it was standing up. Sounds had taken on a thin, tinny quality, as if they were being filtered through this antique phonographic speaker. I'm getting very uncomfortable with this, I told Janine. Maybe we should get back on our route. Don't you want to know what's going on here, she asked. We can't stop now. We must be close to whatever is causing all this. Whatever is causing all this seems to be bending the rules of physics. We have no idea if it's safe. There could be radiation or who knows what. This is far from normal. How about a compromise, she offered. We can go west a few hundred yards, and then if we don't find anything, we can loop back north to our next coordinate. It turns out we didn't have to go more than another 100 yards before we could make out a large hill through the trees. As we approached, it resolved into a large, perfectly conical shaped mound, rising roughly 50 feet above the forest floor, and maybe 100 feet across. The forest continued unabated right up to the top of the mound, and although the trees looked a bit sickly and were fewer and far apart, they were mature oaks, suggesting that the mound had been there for at least a couple hundred years. As we circled the mound to the south and the back of the other side, we came upon a set of metal blast doors set in the side of the mound, about a third of the way up. The doors had the same J2 spiral pattern logo as on the call box, along with a large and faded warning sign declaring that this is a restricted area. Do not approach or enter. The doors had no visible handle, and in any event looked too massive to lift open. As we stood there looking, the ground started buzzing and the undergrowth vibrating. Suddenly we were pulled forward by another shifting gravity, this one much larger than before. I found myself falling face first into the mound, and to my right, Janine had landed on the doors. Instantly the buzzing stopped. I stood back up, but Janine still leaned heavily forward on both hands against the doors. She slowly turned her head, with this freaky vacant look on her face. Her eyes were completely unfocused, and I shit you not, both were tracking in different directions, and said, We wish harmony with you. Only it was not the sound of her own voice coming out of her mouth. It was as if 1,000 different people were whispering the same thing at once, perfectly synchronized. I want unity with you. Join us. Join me. I shouted at her, got right up in her ear and yelled, Janine! But she did not seem to notice. We were synthesis with you. I grabbed her backpack and tugged hard, pulling her off the door. We both tumbled backwards onto the ground. She sat with that vacant look on her face for a few more seconds. Then it was as if she suddenly woke up. She screamed, and the look of sheer maddening terror on her face is something I will never forget. The ground began buzzing again, and the door with it. We are many. We are one. Merge with us, with me. Unite with me, with us, was the call of 1,000 voices from the vibrations of the door. Janine, still screaming, shot up and bolted towards the forest. I followed, calling after her. She ran without looking, careening off of trees, the undergrowth whipping against her. She was finally tripped up, and she lay on the ground crying as I caught up to her. After she caught her breath and stopped crying, I asked her what had just happened, and she kept shaking her head, saying, "No, no, no." I managed to get her to her feet and plotted a course pretty much straight towards our rendezvous point. I tried the walkie-talkie, but the reply was 1,000 whispers. "Come join us. Me. Us." And quickly turned it off before Janine could hear. Then we passed another call box, and I heard faint whispers emanating from it, so I steered Janine away. After another mile, the radio seemed to work okay. I told them Janine had taken a tumble in the underbrush and sprained her ankle, so we were aborting the rest of our coordinates and needed pickup early. I had not written down the digital readout of the 6th coordinate, as we had not recorded any data since, so there was no evidence that anything out of the norm had happened, which was fine with me, and I assumed would be fine with Janine as well. I did not see her again after that day, and upon asking around, I was told she returned to school for a couple of weeks, early for some sorority activities. That was last summer. This summer I interned at a small research firm, and assumed I would never talk to Janine again. We'd only interacted just the 2 or 3 times, after all. But last week I got a voicemail from her. "I need to talk to you about what happened to me. To us. We should meet soon. Call me. Us. Me. Let us know when you can join us." I don't know how she even got my number, as it's unlisted, but I don't think I'm going to call her back.